So they can't say, everybody waits 3 days because we want to have an opportunity to look at them and see if it's a problem. No, you can't do that. They have to release the records within a reasonable time. They can't unreasonably narrow the time during which they're going to provide access to public records. One of my clients at the county, she was like the one administrative person in the building department at the time. She was like the administrative queen bee. You know the type? So they were all building inspectors, plan reviewers, and she was like this administrator. And somebody called and, you know, whack, can't get records from the building department. I'm like, call her up, and she's like, no, I open for public records from 2 to 5 p.m. on Tuesdays. I'm like, couldn't have been Tuesdays, that was kind of commission day, but whatever day it was, I'm like, you can't do that. I've been doing this for 30 years. You can't tell me. I'm like, ugh. So those, and those are it's one of the things that public agencies have done to try to inhibit access to public records, is to say that they're only open at hours that are inconvenient, or for very limited hours, things like that. You don't sue them over all of these things, but these are things that are prohibited by the statute, by the case law. The public agency is only permitted to charge the reasonable cost of production. Like standard letter size copies have an established cost. So the public records law allows a person to review public records without having to pay the cost of copying. The records can be piled onto a table in a conference room, and they can be given access and not have to pay a dime to review the public records. But at the same time, the public agency, as the custodian of the records, has to do something to ensure that they're not stolen, defaced, or altered. There was a trial attorney who used to sue the airport all the time over noise. And he would come in, he didn't want to pay the costs for copying. First of all, he irritated me because he would get one of the airport layout plans and mark it up, and then come back and ask me for another public record. Like, dude, can't you get a copy for yourself? I'm like, ah. But anyway, we got to know each other over the years.
You can mark them up?
No, he would get his own copy and mark it up, and then decide that he needed a clean one for some reason, and come back and make us copy it again for him. But he didn't like, he was convinced, he was a little paranoid, he was convinced that we were learning about his case from simply looking at what records he asked to have copied. So he would bring a portable copying machine in, he would review public records and copy them himself. And he claimed, years later, after he retired and I left the airport, that in one of these fishing trips for records, that he was sitting there looking, and someone opened the door and said, don't turn around, and put a document in front of him that was like a smoking gun. And I told him later, I'm like, you know, you never won any of these cases. You couldn't have been a great smoking gun. That we actually ran into each other at the bar at Caesars 52 a few years ago. Like, he was a funny guy. But, and just in his, I didn't even say his name, but, you know, we were adversaries for years. And yet, when someone at the airport, he was also an aviation crash and burn kind of litigator, and someone at the airport had a relative had a horrible accident in another state, and they needed a plaintiff's lawyer very quickly. I called him and I said, okay, adversaries aside, you need to connect to the plaintiff's bar and find me some referrals for this person. And he was like, so he was a human being. It was like we could put aside our battles and be human, and he helped me out in finding a plaintiff's lawyer when someone needed one. Okay. Anyway, he served on the city planning and zoning board for a while. Too many stories. So they can review public records and not copy them if they choose.
So are you allowed to take your own portable copier?
Yeah, I mean, who does it now? You know, you take a picture, right? If you want to, if you're flipping and you want a little bit of information here and there, it's so easy now. But sometimes cities, I find myself wondering if this would be determined to be a violation of public records law. I know cities who don't. They've eliminated the ability to copy plan size, and they send them out. You know, they do a procurement, they get somebody who bids, and then they send the plan out to be copied, and you have to go pay whatever cost is associated with that private copier to get the copy.
So,
Like cities avoid having to keep equipment to copy 24 by 36 inch plans by outsourcing that.
like a 12 foot by 10 foot, so it's really annoying.
Well, no. What I mean is that they don't want to have a plan copier or a plan printer at all.
Okay.
So they outsource that printing and they outsource that copying to a public, you know, to a business. And then when you go in to look at their old approved plans, you can't get copies from them. You have to go get them from the vendor and pay whatever the vendor price is. And there's this artificial delay. Again, I've waited days. Okay, I've waited more than 10 days to get copies of plans from an outside vendor, and I don't really think that would hold up if it was challenged. Yeah.
Again, with the advent of technology, or even, is it possible just to get a digital copy of the plan?
To get a what?
Digital copy.
Somebody's got to digitize it. You know, so if it's old and all they have is paper and they've never digitized it, then they're going to say, okay, we'll send it out to be scanned, and you'll get a scan 10 days from now. It's like, it's been, and the prices can get, you know, hundreds of dollars.
I can understand just because you have to maintain the documents no matter how old they are, so they have to be in the right temperature, humidity, the storage facility for storing them, the electricity. It's understandable.
They have to, and sometimes I've said, can I just pick it up and take it, you know, take the my copier? No, they have to maintain custody of it. So I went through this also with some documents, some code enforcement lien releases that had to be recorded. The city would not, they put them like in snail mail to the clerk's office, and they got lost at the clerk's office. And I'm like, why didn't you just let me record them? Because they have to maintain custody of their public records. Okay, so a violation of the public records law can result in an award of costs and attorney's fees to the person forced to file suit to obtain the records. My one experience with this, a colleague of mine handled the case. Someone made a public records request to the aviation department. The aviation department responded, but there was a document that was within the request that was only known to the Parks Department, and they didn't go fetch it. And they were sued and found to have violated the public records law for not going to fetch, to figure out if there were documents in other departments. So I don't know if that was a good case or not, but and then the county ended up paying attorney's fees to the plaintiff's lawsuit, to the plaintiff's lawyer for that. Okay, so exemptions from disclosure must be specific legislative exemptions. You can't just arbitrarily decide that, gee, this really seems like private information. If the legislature in Chapter 119 has not created, or somewhere else in the statutes, created an exemption, and it's a public record to begin with, it's not exempt, it must be disclosed. The exemptions are very narrowly construed because in Florida we have a big idea about protecting access to public records. When a local government, I mentioned this, when a local government wishes to assert an exemption, they must specifically cite the legislative exemption that they're claiming. So some of the categories are personally identifying information related to law enforcement and court personnel, law enforcement active investigatory files. There's lots of domestic court-related documents that are exempt. There's lots of law enforcement documents that are exempt. Tests and answers on a professional regulatory board test. So if you're going to take the plumbing exam, You can't make a public records request to get a copy of the plumbing exam before the exam and then get the answers. Okay, it seems obvious, but a specific exemption had to be written or else you would be able to get those records. Public bids, that is until award is made. There's a statewide, and local governments can create economic development programs where they're going to offer incentives to businesses to move to the area, build facilities and create jobs. Those incentive negotiations, economic development incentives, can be kept confidential under certain circumstances with certain limitations, but that's a category of exemption that is kind of interesting. So you might find, if you're looking at an agenda, you might find a motion to approve tax incentives for Project, Panther. And so it's like it's a name they give to the project without describing it for a manufacturing facility in the city of Sunrise that's going to add 360 jobs. And then they limit the amount of information they put in the approval to try to protect the confidentiality. Because if the whole thing falls through, or if it becomes public too soon, then competitors for that industry, will try to get a better deal.
Publix does that.
Mm-hmm.
The Publix supermarkets, they do that.
They do incentive deals and then they keep them confidential.
Right, they put them under those crazy names.
Yep, I've seen it with aviation FBO developments too. Documents clearly made confidential and protected by federal law. So the Social Security number may be that kind of information. So Florida law has to yield to a federal law that specifically says this kind of personal information is confidential and anyone who has it must protect the confidentiality of it. But there are many, 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 many exemptions, and they change. And every year, every time the legislature meets, they adopt a few more exemptions, and the public records, watchdogs cry and scream and yell about more records becoming confidential, but it is the way it is. Okay, so that's all been public records law. What we call the sunshine law is actually the public or open meeting law. It applies to every meeting of a public agency. So you have to understand what's a meeting. A meeting is any time two or more members of a public board discuss business before their board, or that might reasonably be expected to come before their board. That's a meeting. And if there's a meeting, then there must be notice and there must be minutes. Those are the two essentials for a public meeting. There are other things that must happen now with, ADA laws and other things. Meetings must be held in places that are accessible and so on. But the real two critical requirements for a public meeting is that there must be public notice, must be reasonable notice. There's not, other statutes will talk about notice that have to be given for a local government for specific things. Here, for the public records, for the open meetings law, there has to be reasonable notice.
Is that a set time frame, or it's
No.
kind of vague, reasonable?
It is vague. Like, sometimes a city will have its own rules that say this is how we're going to advertise our meetings. We're going to put them on our website. We're going to post them on a board in the lobby, and we're going to publish a newspaper ad once a week. And then they screw something up. And so they evaluate, can we still provide reasonable notice? It was our practice to provide a different kind of notice. It wasn't really a rule. So we posted it, and we put it on the website. We just didn't make the deadline for publishing the ad. Is that really good enough? And they have to make that call, whether the notice that is provided, even though it doesn't meet their own standard, would be considered reasonable notice. I had a case on the Planning and Zoning Board agenda in the city of Fort Lauderdale, and the newspaper didn't print the ad, and the whole meeting was canceled, and my whole project was delayed by a month.
So if they cancel, do they have to provide any type of notice to that?
Well, I found I found out when I was walking up to the building for the meeting. So, you know, they did, I'm sure they posted something that said the meeting was canceled because of a notice defect or something. But it's, so they don't take a lot of risks, and I'll show you why. I'll come back to this, but all actions taken at a meeting in violation of the Sunshine Law are void. So if there's a lot of doubt about whether they have given adequate notice, they err on the side of caution. And they say, let's regroup, let's do the notice over, and come back together and do it right. So just like the Public Records Law did not require the government to make any records for you, the Sunshine Law does not require the local government to talk to you. Okay? The Open Meetings Law applies to meetings of boards. It doesn't apply to meetings of staff. It doesn't apply to meetings between a single board member and staff. It doesn't require the local government to sit down and explain things to you. Now, most of them, that's their job, and they're perfectly willing to sit and meet with you because they want the job to be done right. They want to be helpful. That's their business. But it does not require that local government staff meet anyone or answer any questions. It does not apply to meetings among staff or staff and one board member, provided there's a caveat that a staff member must not be used as a go-between between board members. Okay, if you could see, if you watch a drama on CBS about local government, I know there's not one, but you can imagine that a city manager would go from city commissioner to city commissioner, polling them and tell the colleagues how their colleagues are going to vote on something. That would be a violation of the Sunshine Law, of the Open Meetings Law. It does not usually apply to meetings at which only one member of a public board is in attendance. However, if that board member has been delegated by the entire board to do a job, then their single sole attendance at a meeting can become a public meeting. So this used to happen with procurement committees back when county commissioners participated in procurement committees, that if one county commissioner was appointed to a committee and the rest were staff members, but they were delegated by the commission, then it became a public meeting. And Broward County makes all that stuff public anyway. But so if there's been a delegation of authority, and this could happen, like if a district commissioner is going to go meet with a homeowners association, if it's unprompted by action of the full board, then it's probably not a sunshine meeting. But if a board took action to say, why don't you go figure out what these people want? I don't know, it becomes a little iffy. It might become a public meeting. In an abundance of caution, the public agency might advertise that one or more commissioners may appear at this homeowners association meeting, to try to at least provide public notice. Many local governments advertise attendance of individual commissioners at planned community or advisory board meetings in this abundance of caution because they don't want, nobody wants the commissioner to be accused of violating the Sunshine Law in their activities of just, interacting with their constituents. There are some exceptions to the Sunshine Law that permit private meetings, but they're very limited. I'm going to talk about a shade meeting, but the other notable exception to the Open Meeting Law is negotiations for union, in preparation for union negotiations with public employment unions. So a shade meeting. This statute was enacted during, while I was a county attorney to allow a meeting between an attorney and his or her board to obtain input and strategize regarding settlement or the conducting of pending litigation. So there's a lot of really fiddly requirements to have a shade meeting. The lawyer must be the one to request it. Only certain people can attend. certain notice must be given, there must be a verbatim transcript that will become public later, and there must be pending litigation. And the discussions at the meeting must pertain to that litigation. So if there's a violation of the Sunshine Law, it can void all the actions taken at the meeting for which notice was not provided. Sunshine Law violations can be cured by a properly noticed do-over, but it has to be clear that the matter wasn't just perfunctorily approved or rubber stamped, but that the discussion pertaining to the decision was fully explored at the subsequent do-over meeting. And that is the end of Sunshine Law and Public Records. So what are some strategies to use this understanding when you're preparing to do a development project? What information can you get from the local government that you think might be useful?
Maybe somebody should have the zoning before the way you want to zone, and you can look at what the opposition was to getting the zone.
Permit information, planning and zoning meeting minutes and stuff like that.
That give you a sense of how
How the process works, what type of permits are being issued.
I have pulled staff reports, like if my project had a big setback issue that we were going to have to do a big setback reduction, I've pulled every single project that got setback reductions over a period of time and analyzed how big the setback reduction was, what the opposition to it was, and how each member of the zoning board voted on each setback reduction. Yeah, Dan?
So that's just so the same thing about staff reports, understanding who the board members are for that public agency, figure out, just know them more personally, you know what the behaviors are, what they accept and reject on various types of permit processes, that sort of thing.
Okay, so let's talk about if it's a property acquisition, not necessarily preparing for an application for development approval, but you're just evaluating the property for acquisition. What kind of records does the local government have that you might be able to get through this public records process that would be helpful in a due diligence?
Any type of pending litigation.
Any type of what?
Pending litigation on property.
Yep. I mean, we haven't even touched on court records, but a lot of most civil court records are public also.
They have to have the employment, right? Do they have salaries because you're paying them?
Yeah.
Oh, public employees? Yeah, all their salaries are public information.
No.
Yep, there used to be a reporter at the Sun Sentinel that every few years would get the record of like the 100 highest paid Broward County employees and just publish it. Thank you very much. So for due diligence, you can go to the environmental agencies and find out if there have been environmental violations or spills. You can do a little bit of low rent environmental assessment for yourself. It's not going to be a complete records review like an environmental consultant would do, but it at least gives you an idea. You can look for environmental records of the properties that surround the property that you want to buy to find out if environmental concerns are going to be a big issue. You can get the whole permit history, the whole development approval history on that project. You can probably you might be able to get the actual building plans if it has existing development for the old building. Sometimes they're not available anymore, they're destroyed over time. That kind of thing. What are some of the other things? You need to figure out which agency is most likely to have the records that you want, so you ask multiple agencies. Maybe one request should get it all, but you're never sure, so you have to be aware of what the other custodians, records custodians, where they might be and how you get their records. Okay. So let's think about it from the other side. What does this tell you about, from a defensive perspective? You're submitting an application for your project, and you need to be aware that what's going to become public about the application? Everything. Everything. So if you write a narrative that writes a justification for what you want to do, all of that is going to be public. I mean, it's hard to imagine that you would care, but you need to be aware. So if one of your opposition homeowner association, they assert that you don't really have the wherewithal to build the project, and you're going to tie it up, and it's never going to get built, you don't casually turn your financing documents in to prove that you have the wherewithal to build the project to rebut that, because then it becomes public. You know, you just have to be aware that everything that you submit to that public agency in support of your project, factually or in any other basis, is probably going to become public. There can be some exceptions if you're seeking, if you're building an affordable housing project, and or if you're doing a public-private partnership and you have to give records to the local government as a business partner of the local government, it may be that there's an exemption that can protect your business records, because you're engaging with them in the marketplace, so to speak, not on the regulatory side. I don't know. But it's worth, just be aware that if it's going into the local government, it's going to become public forever and ever. Hallelujah, amen. So you just need to understand it.
I've noticed that when looking at properties, you have true ownership and the actual true ownership of the property, but then you also have another label where it's a property owner, like where you have two differences.
He's talking about like CoStar.
Yeah,
And that's
a
that's-
corporation,
it's irrelevant because
a
they
corporation
usually-
could own it, but if you don't know where to go to find the information on who owns the corporation,
Yeah.
and then it's just under corporation.
people hide everything anyways. They'll open an LLC, have it structured
Yeah.
an operating
Shell
agreement.
company.
Don't have it.
Oh yeah, there's nothing, I mean, there's, in Miami-Dade County and a few other areas that have been prone to mortgage fraud, there is a federal rule that requires disclosure of true equitable ownership.
Well, FinCEN now with the,
Is that it? Is that what the regulation is
well,
called?
FinCEN is the one that regulates the foreign people disclosing their actual person. And then, but a lot of these people, they structure the deal where it's an LLC, and then in the operating agreement, it'll have their equitable portion. But
But
in
there-
Florida, I don't think you have to disclose it.
There are special rules on disclosure of true interest holders that apply to areas where there have been the significant fraud problems. And again, I've got colleagues who do that and know that inside out, and I've only been sort of peripherally aware of it. But it can be, when a rule like this gets adopted, it can be possible to force disclosure even behind those LLCs and so on.
So if someone wants to, let's say purchase a property, right, develop a property, and then after they did the phase one, they find out that it's on Brownsville site, are they required to notify the neighboring neighbors that within 10 feet of that property that they're within the Brownsville site?
Well, okay, so they're evaluating a brownfield. Have they acquired it yet or not?
They not.
What?
They have not.
They have not. If they're not the owner, they don't have to disclose anything to anybody. It's not their property.
Okay, but once they purchase it, acquire it.
Bless you.
But, I think disclosure is triggered by hazardous material release. I'm not aware, and I could be wrong, but I'm not aware of whether the development approval process triggers a requirement to make environmental disclosures. The release itself, the pollution itself, can sometimes trigger disclosure. Did you guys see, and I don't know if anybody's, the governor directed the Department of Environmental Protection to adopt an emergency rule that requires disclosure within 24 hours of any pollution release. Okay, so there's no threshold. I think if you spill gas on the ground when you're pumping gas, I don't know. We haven't seen the rule
I
yet.
think gas stations have like recovery type systems.
I know, but the direction to DEP to adopt the emergency rule was like crazy broad. We haven't seen the rule yet, but it's in response to a sewer break in Pinellas County and a sinkhole caused by another event in Central Florida. So I know, but I found myself thinking, what threshold? All of these environmental laws have thresholds that it has to, the release of hazardous materials has to exceed some minimum threshold before there's legal implications to
Are you
it.
talking about that sinkhole that's leaking, I think you see there CO2 or methane gas leaking there?
I don't know. I shouldn't talk about things that I don't understand better. I read releases about his emergency rule, but not about the things that seem to trigger his emergency rule more. So I don't know, I mean, a local government may have rules about public notice of brownfield development that are individual to the local government. I'm not aware of any standard requirement for disclosure of development in a brownfield.
Yeah, but I know if it's a commercial property within so many feet of that brownfield, they could get a grant or something to renovate the property.
I mean, that's the brownfields programs. That's what they're all about, is incentivizing people to redevelop environmentally damaged property. Yeah. Okay. I have exhausted myself in let's do some housekeeping first. So we're going to have the other two presentations next week. The other thing, what we're going to do next week is the exercise also that I talked about, where you're going to play the roles of developer, staff, elected officials, and neighborhood opposition. So we'll spend probably the rest of the class next week doing that. Then the 15th, my partner is supposed to come talk to you, who was a developer before he went back into private practice, and talk to you about his development experience. I'm not sure exactly how much time he's going to give us. But then, I don't know what we're going to do. So, and I have to find out when my grades have to be turned in relation to our last class, and then we have to decide what the timing will be of the final exam.
I was gonna just add my 2 cents here. I actually learned a lot doing the midterm. So if we could, because we actually get involved and get to pull stuff up. So if our final was like that'd be nice.
You would like to do the final the same
Way
that we did the
because
midterm?
that's what I retained the most is when I was going along and clicking things and kind of digging deeper into the findings and going through the process of finding the information.
I mean, that's the reason I've done it that way all along, but I have to make sure that I have time to grade them and get my grades in before a deadline. So I've got to find out.
It's like usually like 15 minutes after the class is over.
Pardon?
The deadline's usually like another week after class.